You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is episode 88, covering the week of September 4th through September 8th, 2017. And this is your host, Brian McClanahan. Glad to have you back on the program. Glad to be here. Before we get started, just want to remind you that the Abbeville Institute exists on your generous contributions alone. So if you would like to make a tax-deductible contribution to the Abbeville Institute, you can go out to our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. At the top of the page, you'll see a little tab that says Support. Drop that down. You'll see memberships for individuals. And you can give us as little as $3 a month or $25 a year if you are a student, and help us explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. If you're not a student, it's as little as $5 a month or $50 a year, and you can do the same thing. So please go out and consider doing that. It helps keep the lights on, helps keep the podcast going, the website up and running, our programs going. So all of those things are only possible with your support. Also, if you do like this podcast and you like what we put on the website every week, go on out to our social media accounts, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Like us there, subscribe to us there. All of those social media platforms are also on our website, abbevilleinstitute.org. There's little buttons at the top of the page. You can not only subscribe to our YouTube page there, or like us on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter. You can also click the little button for Amazon Smile, and you can help us that way. Every time you purchase something at Amazon, you will be giving a little bit of change back to the Abbeville Institute. So consider making us your charitable organization for Amazon Smile. Also, if you go to our webpage and give us an email address, we will give you a free ebook, Kirkpatrick Sales Emancipation Hell. And you will also get on our email list, you'll get our Daily Dose of Dixie, which comes out Monday through Friday, and our weekly email, which either comes on Saturday or Sunday. So you're going to want to go out there and get that too. Stay informed with the Abbeville Institute through our email list. And that's also a way we communicated about our programs and other things that we have going on. So all of these things are there through our website, which has become a virtual online Southern library. Over 1,000 articles are available for you, hundreds of audio lectures. Of course, this podcast is there as well. The Jim McClellan Library, which contains hundreds of primary documents dedicated to political decentralization. All of those things are up there for free. That's why we ask for donations to help keep the Abbeville Institute going. Okay, so let's talk about this week. September 4th to September 8th, 2017, had a lot of good stuff on the program, a lot of good stuff on the website, I should say. And of course, we're going to have some good stuff to talk about on the program. First and foremost, we had a piece by Ryan Walters entitled Party Truths. Now, the point of this particular piece was to discuss some of the information that's out there from major public figures, quote-unquote conservative figures, like Dinesh D'Souza, Ben Shapiro, and others. PragerU, which has put out a video about the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And, of course, D'Souza's book on the Republican Party and his movie, Hillary's America, and other things. You have this narrative that the Republican Party has always been this noble, very positive party that's never done anything wrong, and the Democrats have always been the bad guys. And Ryan wanted to go and pick apart some of these things a little bit. And while he says there is some truth to this stuff, and personally I did a podcast on this for my own podcast, the Brian McClanahan Show, and it was entitled The Flip. But Ryan does a pretty good job here of talking about how these very easy statements that are made by Shapiro or D'Souza or some others are easily refuted. I mean, it's easy to go out and say, well, the Republicans have always been the good guys, the Democrats have always been the bad guys. Look at things like Jim Crow or slavery or segregation or all these things that are often brought up. The Klan, whatever the case may be, the Democrats were behind all these things. And so Ryan simply goes out and says, well, this is not the entire truth. One of the things that, and he says, the three S's are what these types of Republicans always hammer: slavery, secession, and segregation. And so one of the things that we have to understand is that the Republican Party, the platform of the Republican Party was anti-slavery in that it was anti-slavery extension. So it wasn't necessarily anti-slavery per se, slavery overall. Lincoln, in fact, had said very clearly he was willing to save the Union with the slave states in it. He just didn't want slavery to be able to expand into the territories. And while many Republicans may have had a negative view of the institution, they were perfectly fine. And William H. Seward, in the lead up to the war, was trying to tell Lincoln, we need to keep these border slave states, these upper South slave states, in the Union. And a lot of people don't think about that, but had the South been left to go in peace, the Deep South, you still would have had Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Delaware, Maryland. You still would have had slave states in the Union. And it's clear that most Republicans were comfortable with that, but they didn't want secession to take place because, for a variety of reasons. But I mean, that was the point. We have to save the Union. And that's the most important thing to do, whether that's, as Lincoln said, whether I'm going to save it with all the slave states or no slave states. He said, I'll save the Union however I can, but I'm going to save the Union. So the fact is, this particular position that they were, quote, anti-slavery implies that they were anti-slavery in principle, whereas many Republicans were not anti-slavery in principle. They were anti-slavery extension, which is a key point to make. When again, the question has to be asked: why slavery? Why was slavery important in the 1830s, 40s, 50s? And it was about political power. I think, as Michael Holt has very convincingly shown in his Political Crisis of the 1850s, you're looking at a battle over the spoils of the general government. This is exactly what Calhoun pointed out in his disquisition, where you're going to have two factions vying for the spoils, and they're going to use whatever means necessary, whatever issue they have to use, whatever tricks or tactics they have to use to gain power to keep the spoils, one faction against the other faction. And eventually, as Calhoun knew was going to happen, the South and that faction, which had a different political economic interest than the North, was going to lose that battle. And so this is why he thought about the concurrent majority, because he thought that minorities should be protected within this union. And if you did that, you would have a union of very limited powers, because one side could veto the other, and so the center really couldn't do much other than what was completely agreed upon. He related this to a jury. You have to have unanimity in a jury, and you have to work that out over time. But that's where you get to where you're going to have issues with these factions. You're going to have to work some things out. And so, Ryan points out that some of the talking points that people like D'Souza and Prager and Shapiro use are not necessarily true. They're not entirely true. He points out when people said that all these Confederates were all Democrats, he says, well, some of them were and some of them weren't. Alexander H. Stephens was not a Democrat. He was a Whig. There were a large number of Whigs who had joined the cause for Southern independence. In fact, after the war is over, it's often, one of the things that people are often critical about in the New South period is that a lot of the leaders of the New South were former Whigs who had supported the war, and of course now were in positions of power once the war was over. So the South was not simply just a monolithic one-party section. You did have states like Alabama where it was generally one party, but you did have some dissent in that particular state. And so, again, it's very easy just to say it's this and it wasn't this. And I think, again, Ryan does a pretty good job with that. He also points out that D'Souza says that it was the Democrats who were instituting the Indian policies of the late 19th century, and which were brutalizing the Plains Indian tribes. And this is simply not true. The Republicans controlled the Congress. The Republicans controlled the executive branch, and it was Republicans who were in charge of these things, whether it was Grant or Sherman or Sheridan. They were the ones who were instituting the policies that were, quote-unquote, brutalizing the American Indian tribes. And it was Sherman who said there's no good Indian but a dead Indian, right? So this is this is the fact that you have a situation where these are Republicans, not Democrats. So I mean, again, you're twisting what's going on here. He also brings up the secession position that this is an evil. This is the American political tradition, right, from the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. If you're against that, you have this strange fascination with saying it's somehow treason. Then you are against the entire process of the foundation of what became these United States. And this, again, is an inconsistent intellectual position. So if you're against the South exercising self-determination in 1860 and 61, then you're probably against the American colonies exercising self-determination in 1776. We had a piece on that last week. The British simply said that the South, the British North American colonies, were fighting for slavery. I mean, they said this. So what's the difference? This is where we get into these intellectually inconsistent positions. He also points out, all the racist statements that Republicans have made over time, that they weren't, Jim Crow was actually originated in the North, and we've talked about those type of things on this podcast before. This is where C. Van Woodward and the Strange Career of Jim Crow had pointed this out. It's the North that began segregation, not the South, and that it was one of the things that's interesting about the 1850s, as debates in Congress took place. One of the things the Republican Party said about the South is that it was too integrated. This is where Eric Foner, and probably the only good book he's ever written, which was Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men, pointed out that, look, the thing is, the Republicans were criticizing the South because it was too integrated, and they said they were simply looking for a section of white men, and they wanted the West to be free of any type of people other than white men, whether it was Indians or former slaves. They didn't want them there. So this is something we don't remember about this Republican Party that is supposedly so noble and good. Now, in terms of policy positions, you can see Ryan makes a case that the parties have flipped in terms of policy positions when it comes to political economy, when it comes to the size and scope of government. And I think you can say there has been some of that, though the Republican Party, I think, is a mirage. When it comes to their positions. It's clear. We've seen it. The Republicans are in power and they don't do anything because they really don't believe what they say. Now, some Republicans do, but for the most part, they don't. They're still a national party that has a national economic interest. And what I mean by that is that it's a Hamiltonian system is what they still advocate. They're not really interested. They still believe in a powerful central authority, just a powerful central authority that they want the central authority to do. They're not really interested in decentralization at all. It becomes very clear when you just look at the policies they advocate. So what we've got, and this is what I said in my particular podcast on the issue, is we don't really have Jeffersonian principles in any party anymore that are actually followed. We have Jeffersonian rhetoric on the campaign trail, but no one ever follows those things out to their logical conclusion, which would be, let's implement some of these policies. So this is an interesting piece, and I think well worth your time to read it. Ryan does a very good job taking down some things. On Tuesday, we ran a book review of The Angel of Marie's Heights, written by Les Carroll. This review was written by Barry Kay. And if you don't know the story of Richard Rowland Kirkland from South Carolina, so it's a very amazing story during the Battle of Fredericksburg, which was, this is where Lee remarked that as well that war is so terrible, else men would learn to love it too much, as he's watching the slaughter on the battlefield, as Confederates were giving it to the Union soldiers during the Battle of Fredericksburg. As these Union soldiers going into the night sat and in freezing temperatures, suffering over the wall that the Confederates had been picking them apart all day, Kirkland decided, he asked for permission to go out and tend to these men, bring them water, tend to their wounds, and help them. And he started doing so the next day. And this was why he was called the Angel of Marie's Heights. And there is actually a monument to Kirkland at this spot. And it's a Confederate monument, and it shows the compassion of this Confederate soldier who was later killed during the war. But it's an amazing story. And one Barry Kay says, this is something that he says it's a great. His act of compassion is a great example for young people, but it's also a great example to those of us today who are fighting for the legacy of a Confederate soldier, as well as seeking to preserve all that is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. Part of that legacy, he says, and that tradition is compassion for our neighbor who may also be our enemy. He says, while we should study and arm ourselves intellectually and courageously fight against those who seek to distort our heritage, we should also be ready to perform acts of compassion and mercy when the opportunity arises. This is true. We saw it here with the terrible situation in Houston. Not all the people there in Houston agree on politics or society or what's going on, but people came together in that area, as Southerners do. They went out and just tried to help people and showed this Southern hospitality that the South is so famous for. It didn't matter who you were. They were just there to help. And we're going to have to see that again, unfortunately, as this terrible storm gets ready to hit Florida again. You're going to see that again. Southerners are going to go out of their own way to go try to help people in these areas. And I think that's one of the interesting things about hurricanes and the history of hurricanes. And most of them hit the South, and what Southerners have always been willing to do to help each other, no matter who they are. And this is a great example of Southern humanity. And so I think that this is why I like this little piece so much. It's not long; it's only a few paragraphs, but his conclusion was spot on. And Southern hospitality and humanity. On Wednesday, we ran a piece by yours truly entitled AHA Revisionism. The American Historical Association issued a statement on Confederate monuments on the 28th of August, and it was just ridiculous. And I went into this, and I will go into this in more detail in my own podcast, but just a few highlights from this particular statement. Of course, as you might imagine, the AHA has come out against the monuments, saying that all the talking points that are typically reserved for this particular situation, as I say, this statement is replete with distortions, exaggerations, half-truths, and presentism myths, which it was. Now, first they say they welcome debate, but then they say that much of this public statuary was erected without such conversations, without any public decision-making process. Simply not true. They say that all these monuments were erected without anything resembling a democratic process. Well, again, that's not true. While we can be critical of policies, we look at the disfranchisement of people in the South, white and black. There's actually been some studies done to show that some of the things that were being passed in the early 20th century, late 19th century, some of the legislation was actually disfranchising white Southerners as well, poor white Southerners. So we can look at, and it was more effective than people thought, so we can look at these things. And while that was happening, certainly, there still was a public decision-making process. One thing is that most of these monuments came from private donations, women's organizations which were there for relief, trying to get soldiers' limbs who had lost them in the war, and they weren't allowed to put these things up in the 1860s and 70s, many cases in the 1860s, because the South was under military occupation. And they didn't have any money. One of the first Confederate monuments went up in Linwood Cemetery in Columbus, Georgia, is built of wood. Well, that's not going to last. And so in the 1870s, they put a stone monument up in Columbus. But the fact is, a lot of these things required money to build. And by the time you get to the late 19th and early 20th century, these monuments were being built all over the United States, not just in the South, but in the North, commemorating Union soldiers. You had the Lincoln Memorial go up in the 1920s. So this was a part and parcel of a progressive effort for public beautification. You had all kinds of these things going on. And New Yorkers, Northerners were contributing. There's the Stone Mountain carving in Georgia had to rely on private funding, whereas Mount Rushmore was given public funding. So Southerners were paying for Northern monuments as well as Southern monuments through taxes. They were paying for Northern monuments. Again, that's Northerners were not paying unless they were giving private donations to Southerners for their monuments. And one of the interesting things, they say that no African Americans had any input in these monuments. Well, I bring up one African American that did, and by the way, he was a pretty important guy. It's Booker T. Washington. This is what he said in 1914, quote, We all realize more and more that men like him, Confederate veteran George Paul Harrison Jr., are true friends of our race, that any monument that will keep the fine character of such heroes before the public will prove helpful to both races in the South. So here he has an opportunity to raise questions. The statement says no African Americans had an opportunity to raise questions about the purposes or likely impact of the honor accorded to the builders of the Confederate States of America. No African Americans, that's what they say. None. Well, last time I checked, Booker T. Washington was an African American, and he thought that such monuments would prove helpful to both races in the South. Black Americans often attended the unveiling of these monuments or the ceremonies for these monuments. They did. So if that's the case, I mean, we can gauge, was there some type of interest in these things among the black community? Well, certainly. I think there was. And the AHA is willfully distorting the history here. They say that these the enterprise to put these monuments up was part and parcel of the initiation of legally mandated segregation and widespread disenfranchisement across the South. Memorials were intended in part to obscure the terrorism required to overthrow Reconstruction and to intimidate African Americans politically and isolate them from the mainstream of public life. It's simply not true. And the hundreds, if not thousands, of memorial addresses, dedication ceremonies, and public events, very few, if any, spoke of white supremacy or the attempt to terrorize and intimidate African Americans. I give an example, and you could you could just open these memorial addresses and go read them. Most of them are in public domain. Here's one from 1915, where they were laying the cornerstone to the Stonewall Jackson Monument in Richmond. And this was given by William Anderson, who was a native of Lexington, where Jackson was from. He was a Confederate veteran and also served in the Stonewall Brigade. And this is what he said about this particular monument. Quote, "The example which he, Jackson, gave the world of self-sacrificing devotion to principle and to country, of loyal obedience to duty and unquestioning faith in God, the unsurpassed manifestations of courage which he exhibited, and the radiance with which his genius illuminated the fields of his triumphs, these are reasons why we should memorialize Stonewall Jackson." Anderson believed that these traits would, quote, "compel the admiration alike of friend and foe, and constitute a part of the patrimony of glory, not of Virginia and the Confederate South alone, but of the American people and the human race." So where is the hate here? I mean, this is about the human race. And the AHA also says that these monuments are not history. That defies the value of such monuments as works of art. Is the Lincoln Memorial just a monument? What about Mount Rushmore? What about the Washington Monument? Are these things more than just a monument? Are they not a work of art? So we should just take these things down. And the curious thing is that they say that these monuments, we should learn from places like Memento Park in Budapest. That's a park dedicated to communist monuments that have been removed. So what they're saying is that the Confederacy is as illegitimate as the Soviet Empire, as bloody as Marxism, and it constitutes a foreign part of American history. They're not American. They're not. I mean, they just need to go to a park. That's kind of this other. They also say that this is not going to create a slippery slope, that other things aren't going to be taken down. Simply untrue. Just go and look at the news stories coming across the United States now of other things that are being attacked besides Confederate monuments, whether it's Christopher Columbus or whether it's James Madison High School in Wisconsin or Andrew Jackson, the Richard Stockton bust at Stockton University in New Jersey. I mean, come on, Thomas Jefferson at UVA, the school that he founded. There's all kinds of attacks. And, of course, Annette Gordon-Reed, who's on the board of the AHA, laughs at the fact. She says, this is just silly to think this is going to happen. She says, we can distinguish between people who wanted to build the United States of America and people who wanted to destroy it. I mean, this is just simply stupidity on display. The fact is that many of these prominent Confederate leaders were descendants of Southern founders, and that the United States continued to exist in 1861, even without the Southern states. It was still there. It just didn't have all the states in it. But it still existed. They weren't trying to tear down the United States. They were trying to gain their own independence. This is like saying when the British North American colonies seceded in 1776, they were trying to tear apart the British Empire. They weren't trying to do that. Not at all. So the British Empire continued to exist. In fact, it was stronger, perhaps, when the British North American colonies left. The high point of the British Empire was the 19th century, the 1800s. and the British North American colonies were already gone. So it's an ahistorical, stupid position to take that, but what do you expect? It's par for the course. So you can go out and read the rest of it, and you can actually read the statement yourself. I'd link to it in the article. On Thursday, we ran a piece entitled Lincoln or Lee, What Would Hitler Say? By Alana Mercer. This was actually published at UNTS. But it's a position that Clyde Wilson has taken before. When you look at the statements that Adolf Hitler had made himself in Mein Kampf about who was his favorite leader in American history, he pointed to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was the guy that centralized power and created this climate that someone like Hitler could exist. And she brings up at the beginning that there's this scoffing, from when on Fox News you had somebody say that Abraham Lincoln killed his own people. You've just compared Hitler to Lincoln. How can you do that? And so you can't say these things. You can't say that and this is the exact same thing Ryan was saying, that actually the Republican Party was vicious when it came to things like the Indian tribes, when it came to attacking Southerners. I mean, Sherman was just willing to just bulldoze the South essentially, and these are their own people. It's total war on civilians. So I mean, who are the people that are being exterminated here, and which party is doing the extermination? And this, of course, is Lincoln's party. And this is, again, something that's, you can't say it in polite company or, even on Fox News. You can't say these things. But this is exactly what was happening. And so I think if we want to get real about American history, should we contextualize the Lincoln Memorial and say, here sits a man that was responsible for the deaths of so many Southern civilians, that in his Union Army was, or that it was Lincoln who ordered the execution of 38 Sioux Indians at once during the war because they opposed the Republican Party. That he was the head of the Republican Party that was involved in the extermination of American Indians. I mean, should we start contextualizing? Should we put on his monument all the racist things that Lincoln said? When that happens, I think that, and I'm not saying that won't happen. I mean, with the current climate, it might. But people start to, we can't do that. We can take these things down, but we can contextualize these people, but we can't contextualize or take these people down. This is the hypocrisy of it all, and why none of it should be contextualized, and why none of it should be taken down. Leave it as it is. And in that regard, we had the last piece of the week was written by Michael Martin, Understanding the War on Monuments. Michael Martin had gone to one of these protests at the Calhoun Monument, and he had confronted these protesters peacefully and started asking questions. Things like, do you know that John C. Calhoun served as vice president? Are you aware that John C. Calhoun's theories on limiting government? Are you aware that Calhoun served in the House of Representatives and the Senate, that he was Secretary of War? We have a monument down the street to Denmark Vesey. Are you aware of that? And of course, all he did was have megaphones in his face and get shouted at. The fact is that these people that are protesting don't really know anything. They're just there to protest. And so it proves what this is all about. It's just a ploy, he says, to agitate people and start violence so that these protesters can take the high ground. So the point is, he says, is this movement is to destroy history. It's entirely political. There are communists there, there are Green Party people there, there are all kinds of people there, that this is all about politics. It's not about the monuments or the people on the monuments. It's there to make a political point, and that's it. So it's the push to do things that are simply political, and that is where all of this stuff is going. And so, he says monuments are not the problem today. They're doing their job, bringing people together to discuss issues, but some people don't want to discuss. They just want to shout you down. And I think that's the situation we're running into across America when you start talking about some of the things that are going on. You have monuments being boarded up in other parts of in the northern United States and things of that nature. This is what we're running into across the U.S. This is a political movement, not a cultural or historical movement. It's designed to create a certain political climate. And that's clear when you look at what the protesters are saying or what they're doing when you try to bring up historical context. They don't care about any of that. All they care about is making a political point. And so I think this little piece by Michael Martin does a nice job. He was there on the ground in Charleston at the Calhoun Monument, and people were just trying to shout him down as he was bringing up points, saying, did you know about that? No, they don't care. It's not about that. It's about making a political point. And when they can do that, they're quite happy with that. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this particular episode of the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.